Dr. Morrow, let's move to the causes of the actions, the violent actions that are damaging the image of Islam because all these people are doing these horrible actions in the name of religion. Before you address that, can you explain to me as a religious scholar how you will describe the term? Is there any reality, in reality, is there any existence of radical Islam as we see in the media?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, there's Islam and there is that which is not Islam. And I don't think I think we do a great disservice when we identify these people as Islam, as Muslims and as Islamic. It gives them, a degree of legitimacy that they do not deserve. If your religion teaches you that you should not kill people, that you should not kill civilians, you shouldn't kill women and children and the elderly and the sick, that you are prohibited from sexually assaulting women, you are prohibited from destroying monasteries and churches and obviously mosques, and these people destroy mosques all the time. If your religion tells you one thing and these people are doing the exact opposite, how can you possibly associate them with that religion? No, not at all.
And what is the reason why we see this extremism? Because I am from Pakistan and I have seen my own region transforming. Parts of it, not all of it, but parts of it transforming into a society where a more rigid form of religion that we never knew that has come up. And it is being enforced in different ways. And it has its own manifestations, which we often see in the shape of bomb blasts and killings of innocent people and a lot of destruction. What is the source of this madness?
Well, I mean, the immediate source, we can look at the immediate and we can look at more distant causes for this. I mean, ultimately it traces back to the time of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. There were a group of people who came to the Prophet and they asked him how often he prays. And he said, this is what I do every night. And they thought that was very little. It wasn't enough. So they thought that they were better than him, that he wasn't religious enough for them. These are people who came to him and they had scars on their forehead because they were so fanatical in their prayers. And the Prophet cursed them. And he cursed the extremists. And these people resurfaced, a few decades after as the Khawarij or the Kharijites. And so there was a conflict in the Muslim community between the followers of Ali and the followers of Aisha and Muawiyah and so on. And they were the first to do takfir, which is to say that another Muslim is not a Muslim, that they're infidels and their blood is halal. So they said that the Sunnis were kuffar and the Shiites were kuffar. And so there are elements of Kharijite ideas in these extremist groups today. There was another group of people known as the Nawasib. And the Nawasib were people who hated the household of the Prophet. And they despised them, they persecuted, they killed him, and so on. And also there are elements from, the Umayyads and so on that come into play. We have no problem, of course, with the four rightly guided caliphs. Why are they called the rightly guided caliphs? Well, because they were rightly guided. And why do we not apply that term to the caliphs and the sultans that came after? It's because, righteousness had left. Some of them were good, some of them were bad. Some of them, the early Umayyads, Yazid, for example, committed all types of atrocities in the name of Islam. I mean, he set fire to the Kaaba. He attacked Medina. His soldiers raped thousands of women. They slaughtered companions of the Prophet. They were all doing this in the name of Islam. And so all of these factors come into play. And so it resurfaces in Arabia about 200 years ago with a man named Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab who did takfir of all Muslims. he said that the Sunnis had returned to polytheism, and that the Shia, they were worse than Christians and Jews, that they were kuffar and their blood was halal. He says that you can kill Muslims, you can enslave their women. If you go back and you study Wahhabism, this ideology, Wahhabism, Salafism, jihadism, takfirism, which is only 200 years old. Okay, so this is the root of all of these different movements. Now, I have to, contextualize things a little bit. So this was, an isolated movement that spread throughout Saudi Arabia. But what happened? Well, colonialism and imperialism had a devastating, catastrophic impact on the Muslim world. In many parts of the Muslim world, you had almost absolute literacy, even among women, even among girls, because at the very least, Muslims expected that children could read the Quran. So everyone could, at the very least, read the Quran. And then you had the Europeans, the French, right, and the British, and so on, who invaded the Muslim world. And within one generation, you went from almost complete literacy to almost complete illiteracy. So there was a void there. And who filled that void? Well, these Salafi, Wahhabi, Takfiri people who had taken over Mecca, who had taken over Medina, and who wanted to destroy the grave of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. And so these people assumed political power. And they filled this vacuum that was left in the wake of colonialism and imperialism. And of course, this coincides with, this oil boom and all of this wealth. So they start funding all of these schools. They build mosques all over the world. They build universities where they disseminate this, what they present as, pure, true, monotheistic Islam. But the problem is, they believe that they are the only saved sect, and that all other Muslims have gone astray, and that all of the Muslims are astray, and they're not real Muslims,
but
and so on.
This argument, because what
Yes.
you have mentioned, you have traced the whole history, and it all comes to the narrative.
Yes.
Our narrative has defined
Absolutely.
and redefined the Islamic history.
Absolutely.
And you traced it right from the days of Prophet Muhammad.
See,
peace be upon
people
him.
have an emotion. Muslims have an emotional connection to Mecca and Medina,
Right.
and their natural assumption is that whatever is emanating from those centers is true Islam. But this is not the true Islam that existed in Mecca and Medina.
But where does
Yes.
the politics come into play? Because if you look at it,
Yes.
there is one narrative that you mentioned, and certainly it has. But do you believe that this is the only reason that is impacting? You did mention that colonialism and imperialism did impact, and it had a horrible impact
Yes.
on Muslim society.
Absolutely.
But do you believe that this extremism, the phenomena of extremism, and then which transforms into terrorism, is happening just because of the Takfiri movement or Wahhabism spread, or there are other reasons as well?
Well, it definitely plays, a large factor, because they invest billions and billions of dollars in disseminating this ideology all over the world. They control the centers of learning in the universities. So people will, they'll leave a country like Morocco, and they'll go to some of these universities, and they'll come back and they'll start telling their family and their community that they're not real Muslims, and that this clothing isn't Islamic, and this is bid'ah, and this is shirk, and so on. And they create all kinds of fitna and so on. So there's an ideological component, but there's also an economic component as well. That plays a role, and there is a political component as well. You'll find that often the people who are disseminating this ideology really don't follow this ideology. They're not religious people.
Right.
They're quite corrupt, but it serves their geopolitical aims.
Because we saw it in Afghanistan.
Yes.
We saw it elsewhere as well.
Absolutely. So I'm not just saying it's just the Saudis and the Gulf Arabs who are behind this. Absolutely not. If we're familiar with our history, we'll find during the First World War, Both sides were using Muslims, radicalized Muslims, in order to fight on their behalf. In the Second World War, we find that the Nazis were using, what we would call today Islamist, jihadist, Muslim terrorists for their own cause. And also, the British were doing the same thing.
But we
So
are seeing the same
explore-
thing. Let me connect it
Yes.
here. We are seeing the same thing in Yemen. We are seeing the same thing
Yes.
in Iraq. We are seeing the same thing in Syria and elsewhere as well, even parts of Afghanistan and parts
Yes.
of Pakistan. Behind all whatever you see,
Yes.
you see two major powers.
Absolutely, absolutely.
One is Iran, the other is Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
Both profess totally different religious ideologies. What would you call it? Is it a war between two ideologies? Is it a war between two Arabs and Ajams? Is it politics? Is it religion? How will you define it?
Good. But we have to rewind a little bit because, I got into the Europeans and how they use these people, to serve their own political aims. We get into the 20th century. We find that, we're in the Cold War. We have the United States on one side and we have the Russians on the other. And we find the Americans using these people, these Takfiri Wahhabis, in order to fight the Soviets. And so they bring them from Egypt, they bring them from Arab countries and Pakistan and all over the Muslim world. They bring them there and they use them for their own aims, right? It's what we call a proxy war. So we have what's going on right now in the Middle East is also a proxy war between powers. Now, you mentioned some regional powers. You mentioned the Saudis and you mentioned the Iranians. There is no doubt about this, that the Saudis are using these Takfiri Wahhabis against Iran and their ally Syria, okay? And who's behind them? We have Russia, and then we have these extremist groups being funded and armed by the Gulf Arabs, primarily by Saudi Arabia and Qatar. But who's behind them? Well, it's the Americans who are behind them,
So, do you mean to say that the religion has been sandwiched in this power,
No, no,
regional
no.
or international
What
power
they're
struggle?
trying to do.
What would you call it? Like how I want to
Yes.
just make our viewers understand that how should we look at it? What exactly is it? I'm just trying to understand. Is it a religious war? Is it a political war? Or is it politics using religious argument?
No, it's absolutely politics using religion. It's turning, we find often that, secularists or atheists and so on will pit one religion against another in order to destroy all religions. They will try to turn Christianity against Islam, Islam against Christianity. And what they're doing is they're trying to split the ummah in half, okay? Who's
But those efforts have always been in human history, not just Islam.
Yes.
It's about every group.
Yes.
There have always been powers which will be there and they will be trying to divide you. But who is willing to be divided?
Yes.
That's the problem, right? So how will you counter that? Because it is, if I am saying that radicalism
Yes.
or religious extremism is a huge problem, not for the world. Of course it is for the world, but for me as well, because it's my son and daughter who is at stake, whose life is at stake. So what should I do at my end?
Well, we shouldn't fall into this trap. They want to divide Muslims. They want to create a Sunni-Shia war, where in many of these countries, Sunnis, Shias, and Sufis lived and coexisted together. I mean, there were differences of opinion and so on. But if you look at Islamic history as a whole, it was very multicultural, multilingual, very cosmopolitan, very open-minded. The caliphs would bring people of all religions and people of no religion, even atheists and free thinkers, and they would have cordial debates in the palaces, right, going going back and forth, kind of like these gatherings we have in interfaith groups, trying to get along, trying to understand one another. So in general, there was a great deal of coexistence and understanding, but they are trying to divide us. They are trying to weaken us. It's not as if they support these extremists. They will, like, for example, the Americans would like to use these extremists to overthrow Assad and then probably exterminate those extremists or abandon them or use them in some other context where they're useful. But the problem is there's 40,000 of them, and once this conflict is over, if they succeed, then they will have a center of power.
But you can defeat, you see, Americans are fighting
Yes.
their own war. Of course, America has its own interest. Every country has
Yes.
its own interest, and they will do that. My question is that as a Muslim, I am confronting a narrative
Yes.
which is taking over my society.
Yes.
It's not Americans who are bringing, parachuting that narrative. It is coming from the people who are saying the same kalima that I say.
Yes.
How can I counter that?
Well, we have to counter this fake Islam with true Islam. And what is true Islam? I'm talking about true, traditional, civilizational Islam, not this takfiri Wahhabi ideology. So we have to become re-rooted in our tradition. I address issues that many people do not address. I think it's important to make it clear that that these interpretations are completely erroneous. They have no basis in the Quran and the Sunnah, and according to the ijma or consensus of our ulama for the past 1400 years. It's a complete and total aberration of Islam. So yes, I call for a return to true traditional civilizational Islam.
So you inaugurated the Interfaith Institute at the Islamic Center of Long Island a couple of days back. Tell us more about it, what kind of initiative it is.
Well, it brings together Muslim leaders and Christian leaders, Jewish leaders, Buddhist leaders, and just other human beings, people of faith, and different groups. It's certainly an effort that I applaud and that I support. It's extremely important to build bridges of understanding and to get to know our neighbors. Quite often, people have certain stereotypes, especially due to the negative, the way Muslims are portrayed in the media. Well, I would encourage you as a Christian or as a Jew or as a Hindu to get to know a Muslim, and you'll realize that they're really just ordinary people. And, Muslims get to know a Jewish person. They're completely normal, decent human beings. And so really often when, you just bring other people into the mosque, they might have this impression that, some are really stressed going to a mosque. They think that, people just be, sitting around there cleaning their teeth with knives or so on, sharpening swords. And yes, the bomb-making clinic is at 2 o'clock in the basement. It's not at all like that.
Right.
We are professors, we are engineers, we are medical doctors, we're business people, we're hardworking people, we're family people. So definitely, the best form of dawah, the best form of tabligh is through practice. It is through actions. It is through engaging with others, engaging with society.
Let's watch a few clips of this inaugural ceremony of the Interfaith Institute at the Islamic Center of Long Island. Then we'll come back and ask some more questions from Dr. Morrow. So, viewers, you just watched the clips of the inauguration ceremony of the Interfaith Institute at the Islamic Center of Long Island. Let me ask you, Dr. Morrow, what would be the best advice that you will have for the Muslims who are not just living in the US but in societies where they are a minority? How should they conduct themselves to defeat and deflect the image that is being created by negative media portrayal as well as the actions of few individuals who use religion's name for their bloody actions?
Um, I think they should be more active. They should be more engaged in education. And what better tool than the covenants of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. I would encourage them to read the book, to disseminate the book, to share the book, to get the books into public libraries and university libraries. And also to be engaged at all levels of society, engaged in social work. I mean, as I mentioned, the best form of dawah, the best way of improving the image of Islam is just by being good Muslims. I will give you a concrete example of how these covenants can be put into practice. Unfortunately, there are some African American churches that have been targeted by some hate-filled people. There have been some cases of arson, and who spearheaded this effort in order to rebuild or to repair this church, African American church that had been burned to the ground, but a Muslim woman, and who's raised over $100,000 to repair that church. So we should stand in solidarity with our Christian neighbors and our Jewish neighbors and our Buddhist and Hindu neighbors. So that's putting the covenants of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, into practice.
So, in other words, we should interact more, we should be part of the mainstream, we should act just like an ordinary American because we are ordinary Americans or we are anywhere, we are part of that society.
Yes, let me give you just one more example. There were these hate rallies organized throughout the country, around mosques, armed manifestations meant to intimidate Muslims. Things could have gotten very ugly when you come with loaded weapons and machine guns and so on. But how did Muslims respond? They didn't fight fire with fire because, the Quran teaches us to fight evil with something that is better, with good. And so they didn't meet them with arms, right? They didn't barricade themselves and so on and get ready for a military conflict. I mean, you aim a weapon at someone, something might happen, okay? You aim a gun at my wife or my child, it's not a good idea. But they greeted them with hospitality, with open arms, with hugs. They opened the doors to the mosques. They offered them tea, they offered them snacks, and they gave them tours of the mosque, and they talked about Islam, and they realized that they had been misled, by hate mongers in the media, right, inciting hatred against Muslims, which is a form of inciting violence against Muslims. And these people realize that, the portrayal of Muslims in the media does not correspond with the Muslim reality. And actually, some of these people who went there with hatred in their hearts and so on, were so moved by their encounter with Muslims that some of them actually embraced Islam. Now, we're not asking for people to embrace Islam. If they want to, marhaba, they're more than welcome. We're just looking to build friendships, okay?
And greater understanding of...
Absolutely. I mean, we have so many enemies in the world. Couldn't we use a few friends?
Absolutely, we can, and certainly we need to. Thank you so much, Dr. Morrow. Viewers, you listened to Dr. Morrow's thoughts, views, and his research, his incredible research that he has done on the life of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And his writings are amazing. They are having a huge impact. And he's part of the movement. He's leading a movement which the Muslim community all over the world, whether they are in minority or in majority, need it, because tolerance is the first lesson that you get from Islam. And Muslims and everybody else need to learn that for mutual, peaceful coexistence and showing more respect to each other. And that's how we can build more peaceful and prosperous societies. Dr. Morrow, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And I hope that your stay in New York will be good, and people who will be coming to your events will learn a lot from your insight. Thank you so much for joining us for this special episode. I am Jehangir Khattak. Good night.